Welcome to the Sleepy Mythologist, where we explore ancient myths with a calming touch. Tonight we journey into the cold, thunderous skies of the Norse cosmos to uncover the true power and mystery behind Mjolnir, Thor's mighty hammer. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of divine order, protection, and raw, uncontrollable force. But why was it feared even by the gods themselves? Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Leave a comment. Whether you're nestled in the fjords of Norway, relaxing under the stars in New Zealand, or curled up in bed somewhere in between, I'd love to know. Now, take a deep breath, and let's dive into the myth. Long ago, in the twilight world of Norse myth, where gods and giants clashed in timeless struggle, there lived a trickster named Loki. With a sharp tongue, a clever mind, and a habit of causing chaos wherever he went, Loki often danced on the line between ally and enemy. One day, his mischief crossed that line. He had cut off the golden hair of Sif, Thor's beloved wife. Whether out of jealousy, boredom, or some deeper, more mysterious plan, Loki had played his prank without considering the consequences. Thor, the thunder god, was furious. His rage shook the halls of Asgard like a summer storm. He threatened to break every bone in Loki's body unless he restored Sif's beauty, and fast. With no other option, Loki fled to Svartalfheim, the underground realm of the dwarves. These were no ordinary smiths. They were the sons of Ivaldi, legendary craftsmen who forged wonders beyond mortal imagination. Loki pleaded with them, charming them with promises and flattery, asking them to craft new hair for Sif, this time spun from real gold, glowing like sunlight. But Loki, being Loki, couldn't resist turning a simple task into a contest. After convincing the sons of Ivaldi to forge 3 treasures, the golden hair for Sif, the ship Skidbladnir for Freya, and the spear Gungnir for Odin, Loki challenged another pair of dwarven brothers, Brokkr and Sindri. He wagered his head that they could not forge treasures to match those of the sons of Ivaldi. Intrigued and insulted, the brothers accepted. And so, deep within the glowing embers of their forge, the hammering began. Brokkr worked the bellows while Sindri shaped the creations. They poured molten gold and flame into forms, whispered ancient spells, and summoned the power of the earth itself. But Loki, desperate to win the bet and keep his head, tried to sabotage them. Disguised as a biting fly, he hovered and stung Brokkr repeatedly, especially when the bellows had to be held steady. He bit his eyelid, drawing blood and nearly breaking the brothers' rhythm. Despite the distractions, the brothers completed 3 items: a golden bristled boar, a golden ring that multiplied itself, and lastly, Mjolnir the hammer. But there was one flaw. The handle of the hammer was shorter than intended, too short for a 2-handed grip. Loki laughed, thinking this mistake would win him the bet. But the gods did not agree. When all the treasures were brought before Odin, Thor, and the other Aesir, the decision was swift. The boar, Gullinbursti, was given to Freya, shining bright enough to light the darkest night. The ring, Draupnir, would drip 8 new rings every 9th night, a gift of endless wealth for Odin. But it was the hammer that stunned them all. Despite its short handle, it was unlike anything they had ever seen. Mjolnir could level mountains with a single strike. It never missed. It would always return to Thor's hand, no matter how far it flew. And perhaps most remarkably of all, when Thor wore his magical iron gloves and belt of strength, he could wield the hammer with even greater force, summoning storms and thunder with every blow. Even the flaw seemed intentional, as if it belonged that way. The hammer was heavy and compact, like the concentrated weight of the storm itself. The gods declared it the greatest treasure of them all. Loki lost the bet, but managed, as usual, to talk his way out of losing his head, arguing that the wager was for his head, not his neck, and no one could cut one without the other. Thus, through a web of mischief, trickery, blood, and fire, the most feared weapon in Norse mythology was born. Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor, forged not in peace but in chaos, its creation a tale as stormy as the god who would one day wield it. At first glance, Mjolnir didn't look like the kind of weapon that could strike fear into the hearts of frost giants or bring entire mountains crashing to the ground. It was short, almost awkwardly so, unlike the grand two-handed warhammers one might expect a thunder god to carry. Mjolnir had a compact handle, barely long enough for one strong hand, but in the world of Norse myth, appearances often conceal deeper truths. The story of Mjolnir's short handle began, as many things in Norse myth do, with Loki. As the tale goes, when the dwarven brothers Brokkr and Sindri began forging the hammer in their underground forge, Loki attempted to sabotage their work. Disguised as a fly, he bit and stung Brokkr at the most critical moments, trying to throw off the precise timing of the bellows. One well-placed sting caused Brokkr to briefly lose control just as the hammer was taking shape, resulting in its handle being shorter than intended. In any other story, such a flaw would ruin the weapon. But this was no ordinary forge, and this was no ordinary hammer. Despite its short handle, Mjolnir emerged as the most powerful object ever crafted by dwarven hands. The flaw, rather than a weakness, became part of its mystique. It suggested that even chaos could not ruin what fate had already chosen to be great. Thor did not seem to mind. In fact, the shorter handle made the hammer feel closer to him, more personal, more like an extension of his own arm. With his enchanted iron gloves, Jarngriper, and the magical belt Megingjord, which doubled his already immense strength, Thor could wield the hammer with terrifying speed and power. The shorter handle allowed for rapid strikes, tight grips, and more direct combat. It was the hammer of a warrior who fought in close quarters, face to face with his enemies. It's important to remember that in Norse mythology, tools and weapons weren't just physical objects. They were bound up with meaning, magic, and fate. The shortness of the handle made Mjolnir unmistakable. No other weapon looked like it. It was a symbol of divine imperfection, of power that didn't need to be grand in appearance to be devastating in effect. It reminded the gods, and those who heard the tales, that greatness is not about looking perfect, but about being perfect for your purpose. Mjolnir's design also reflected Thor's role in the Norse cosmos. He was not a distant, untouchable deity. He walked among the people, protected farmers and fishermen, and battled the monstrous forces that threatened the world. His hammer was practical, not ornamental. Unlike Odin's spear or Freya's magical ship, Mjolnir was a tool of brutal necessity. It didn't soar gracefully. It crashed. It didn't dance through the air. It smashed through skulls and stone. The hammer became so iconic that it was adopted as a symbol throughout Viking society. Small Mjolnir pendants have been found all over Scandinavia, worn as protective amulets by warriors, farmers, and even children. The people didn't just admire the hammer, they trusted it. It was the divine symbol of protection against chaos, storms, and evil. And part of its power came from its distinctive stout form. The shape of Mjolnir also carried ritual meaning. It was used not only in battle, but also in sacred ceremonies. During marriages, Mjolnir was placed on the bride's lap to bless the union with fertility and strength. During funerals, it was raised to protect the dead on their journey to the afterlife. During births, it was invoked to guard the fragile boundary between life and death. The hammer, in all its odd compact glory, had become a bridge between realms, the human and the divine, the mortal and the eternal. And yet the hammer's greatest symbolic feature may be the very thing that made it seem imperfect. Its short handle was a reminder that even divine power can bear the marks of struggle, that even a god's weapon may be shaped by chance, by flaw, by resistance, and that what seems like a mistake at first may, in the end, be exactly what is needed. Mjolnir's short handle is not a defect. It is a lesson, quietly whispered through the thunder, that strength often comes from imperfection, and that what fits best in your hand may not be what others expect to see. Thor, the thunder god, is one of the most iconic figures in all of Norse mythology. Towering, red-bearded, and immensely powerful, he was the divine protector of both gods and humans, standing between the realms of order and chaos with unwavering strength. Yet to truly understand the power of Mjolnir, we must understand the hand that wielded it, Thor himself, the god who brought thunder, lightning, and justice wherever he went. In the grand structure of the Norse cosmos, Thor was a member of the Aesir, one of the two primary families of gods. Unlike Odin, the Allfather, who ruled through wisdom, cunning, and sacrifice, Thor's strength lay in his raw, unrelenting force. He was the warrior of Asgard, the god who fought the battles others could not win, who stood on the front lines when Jotnar, the fearsome giants, threatened to overrun the world of gods and men. His very name means thunder, and in Old Norse it is Thor. To the ancient Norse, thunder wasn't just a weather event. It was the sound of Thor's chariot, drawn by two massive goats, Tangrisnir and Tanningnjosta, rumbling across the heavens, lightning. That was the flash of Mjolnir as it split the sky. Every storm that rolled over the fjords and forests of Scandinavia was seen as evidence of Thor's presence, a reminder that he was watching, fighting, protecting. But Thor was not just a destroyer. He was a guardian of sacred boundaries. He defended the realm of the gods, Asgard, from the chaos beyond. He kept the Jotnar, ancient beings of elemental power and disorder, at bay. And he was beloved by the common people, not for being wise or philosophical, but for being strong, dependable, and real. He was the everyman's god. While Odin might meditate on runes or whisper secrets into the ears of ravens, Thor would take up his hammer and face danger head-on. He didn't deal in prophecy, he dealt in action, and Mjolnir was the tool of that action. The relationship between Thor and Mjolnir was more than that of a warrior and his weapon. The hammer was part of him. It was said to never fail, never miss, and always return to his hand after being thrown. This returning motion symbolized not just power, but loyalty. Mjolnir was not merely a tool, but a companion, an extension of Thor's divine will. And the strength with which he wielded it was unimaginable. Even among gods, Thor's power was legendary, but it was amplified by two sacred items, the Meggingjörd, a magical belt that doubled his strength, and the Jarngriper, iron gauntlets that allowed him to grasp and control the volatile energy of Mjolnir. With these, Thor became an unstoppable force, a living storm. Wherever giants plotted or monsters stirred, Thor was there, hammer in hand, ready to strike. Many of the stories told about Thor involve his incredible strength and his battles with beings far larger and older than himself. He wrestled with cosmic serpents, drank from a horn that was secretly connected to the ocean, lowering the sea itself, and lifted an enormous cat that was actually the disguised form of the Midgard serpent Jormungand. In each case, even when he was deceived or tested by magic, Thor's raw power remained unmatched. But power alone does not explain why Thor was so beloved. It was his character, straightforward, loyal, courageous, that made him a central figure in Norse belief. He didn't shrink from danger, he didn't back down. And unlike Odin, who often relied on cunning and secrecy, Thor was honest in his might. What you saw was what you got. Thunder, justice, and protection. In a world full of uncertainty, where winter could last years, where raids and famine were always near, Thor was a comforting symbol. His presence meant safety. His hammer meant stability. To many Norse people, he wasn't just a distant deity, he was family. They called on him to bless marriages, births, and voyages. They carved his hammer into pendants, carried his symbol into battle, and whispered his name in prayer during storms. In many ways, Thor represents the heart of Norse mythology, not the complicated politics of the gods or the doom of Ragnarok, but the eternal struggle of light against dark, order against chaos, and courage against fear. He was the thunder rolling in your bones, the hammer in your dreams, and the god who would never, ever stop fighting for those he loved. And through it all, Mjolnir was always there, resting in his hand, humming with the force of creation and destruction. Inseparable from Thor, it was the perfect weapon for a god whose strength echoed through the very skies. The realm of the gods, Asgard, stood high above the other worlds of Norse cosmology, a shining, fortified city of divine halls, radiant light, and celestial order. But it was never safe. Beyond its gleaming walls lay the wild, untamed lands of the Jotnar, the frost giants, fire giants, and ancient elemental beings who despised the gods and their carefully constructed world. These weren't villains in the simple sense. They were forces of nature, chaotic, powerful, and ancient beyond time, and they longed to bring Asgard crashing down. Against this looming threat, no god stood taller than Thor. Thor was Asgard's shield, its relentless guardian, the one who met the darkness face to face so others could sleep in peace. His hammer, Mjolnir, was the line in the sand, the final word, the last hope, and the first blow. Without Mjolnir, the gates of Asgard would have been shattered long ago. The hammer wasn't just a weapon of war, it was the very foundation of the god's defense, forged for the single purpose of keeping chaos at bay. Day after day, Thor rode out in his chariot, pulled by his two massive goats, Tangrisnir and Tangnjosta, the wheels sparking lightning across the sky, thunder rumbling in their wake. These weren't idle patrols. Thor's journeys were constant battles, giants rising from the earth, monsters lurking in mountain passes, dark magic stirring at the edges of reality. And with every clash, it was Mjolnir that answered. The giants feared the hammer, for they knew it had the power to end them in a single blow. It could crush skulls, level entire hillsides, and send even the mightiest Jotun fleeing in terror. When Thor hurled it across the sky, it screamed like a falling star, crashing into its target with unimaginable force, then returned to his hand, hungry for more. But Mjolnir wasn't simply about destruction, it was also a weapon of protection. His very presence kept the balance of the cosmos intact. It maintained the invisible barrier between Asgard and the untamed worlds beyond, between order and chaos. The hammer was called upon to bless newborns, sanctify marriages, and consecrate sacred oaths. In each case, it served as a divine seal of protection, an unbreakable assurance that the gods were watching and that Thor would come if danger arose. There were many stories of Mjolnir being used to save Asgard from disaster. One such tale tells of the giant Hrungnir, a being made of stone, who came swaggering into Asgard after being tricked by Loki. Though at first the gods tried diplomacy, they quickly realized the giant was a threat to everyone there. Thor, returning home from a journey, challenged Hrungnir to a duel. The giant accepted, confident in his invincibility. But when the two met on the battlefield, there was no contest. Thor hurled Mjolnir, and it struck the giant with such force that his skull split open like a mountain blasted by lightning. Even the fragments of the shattered hammer embedded themselves in the earth with divine fire. In another tale, a giant named Thrym managed to steal Mjolnir while Thor was sleeping. Thrym hid the hammer deep beneath the earth and demanded the goddess Freyja as his bride in exchange. The gods were thrown into panic. Without Mjolnir, Asgard was exposed, vulnerable. Thor, furious and embarrassed, agreed to a plan. He would dress as Freyja and attend the wedding to retrieve the hammer. In disguise, with veil and jewels, Thor sat across from Thrym, who was confused by the bride's enormous appetite and piercing eyes. At the moment the hammer was brought out to sanctify the marriage, Thor threw off his disguise and seized it. With a roar, he brought Mjolnir down on Thrym and his kin, destroying them all in a thunderous fury. Order was restored. Asgard was safe once again. These stories are more than just action-filled tales. They reflect something profound about the Norse understanding of the world. Safety was never taken for granted. The line between peace and annihilation was razor-thin, and it was only through vigilance, strength, and sacred power that life could continue. Thor was not simply fighting enemies, he was holding back the end of everything. This is why Mjolnir wasn't kept locked away in some treasure room, guarded and untouched. It was always at Thor's side, worn and tested, ready at a moment's notice. It was a working weapon, part of the ongoing struggle for survival. Its thunder wasn't a myth. It was a warning, a promise, a symbol of the gods' determination to protect not just their realm, but the fragile balance of the entire cosmos. To the Norse people who lived in a world of violent storms, freezing winters, and constant conflict, the image of Thor riding into the storm, hammer raised high, wasn't just inspiring, it was essential. It reminded them that somewhere out there, someone was keeping the dark forces away, that someone would always rise no matter how many giants appeared on the horizon. And at the heart of that image, flashing with lightning and shaking the heavens, was Mjolnir, the protector of Asgard, the hammer of thunder, the most feared weapon in the 9 realms. In the world of Norse mythology, Mjolnir held a dual nature that few weapons in any tradition could claim. It was not only an instrument of destruction, but also a sacred object of blessing and healing. While most imagine Thor's hammer crushing giants, splitting mountains and shaking the skies with thunder, it also played a quiet, symbolic role in moments of peace, at weddings, births, oaths, and funerals. It carried both the weight of divine fury and the gentleness of protection. It was the hammer that destroyed evil, but also the hammer that sanctified life. This duality reveals something deep about the Norse worldview. In a harsh and unforgiving land, power was essential, not just for victory in battle, but for survival in everyday life. Yet the same strength that could bring down enemies was also needed to bless marriages, to protect newborns, and to ensure that the sacred order of life continued. Thor's hammer was the embodiment of that principle. It could kill, but more importantly, it could consecrate. In ancient Norse rituals, Mjolnir was invoked during marriage ceremonies to hallow the union between husband and wife. The most famous example is the tale of Thor and the giant Thrym, who stole Mjolnir and demanded the goddess Freyja in exchange. In the story, the hammer was to be presented during the wedding to bless the union, a clear sign that Mjolnir was not merely a weapon, but a sacred object used in holy rites. Even the giants, enemies of the gods, recognized its spiritual authority. When Thor, disguised as Freyja, finally regained his hammer at the ceremony, he used it not to bless the wedding, but to unleash his fury. Still, the original purpose of Mjolnir in the ritual, to consecrate the marriage, remains significant. It suggests that the hammer's power went beyond the battlefield. It was a divine seal, used to sanctify bonds between people, to mark transitions, and to protect sacred promises. Mjolnir was also used in birth rites, called upon to bless infants and protect them from malevolent spirits. In a world where childbirth was dangerous and mortality rates were high, the presence of the hammer brought reassurance and hope. Just as Thor protected Asgard from giants, so too could his hammer protect the most vulnerable in human society. A symbolic gesture, a sign drawn in the air, or a carved pendant placed near the child was enough to invoke its protective power. Even in death, Mjolnir played a role. During funerals, the hammer was used to bless the deceased, to ensure safe passage to the afterlife and ward off forces that might disturb the journey. The Norse believed in multiple realms of the dead, Valhalla for fallen warriors, Helheim for others, and these realms were not free from danger. A funeral blessing with Mjolnir was a way of marking the body and soul as under divine protection, watched over by the god who held the balance between life and death. The hammer's role in these rituals was so important that its symbol became widespread across Viking society. Amulets shaped like Mjolnir were worn not just by warriors, but by women and children, by sailors and farmers. These amulets were not just tokens of strength, but charms of blessing and spiritual protection. In times of fear or uncertainty, touching the hammer was like calling on the storm god himself to stand guard. This dual role of Mjolnir, destroyer and protector, punisher and blesser, mirrored Thor's personality. He was fierce, yes, but he was not cruel. He used his strength to uphold the balance, to defend the weak, and to keep chaos at bay. He was not a god of war for war's sake, but a god of order in a world that teetered constantly on the edge of disaster. When he smashed giants with his hammer, he was not being wrathful. He was fulfilling a divine duty to protect life, to ensure that the cosmos remained in balance. Even the hammer's construction hinted at this dual purpose. Forged by dwarves, creatures who lived deep within the earth and understood the mysteries of metal and magic, Mjolnir contained the essence of opposites. It was heavy, yet fast. It was flawed, yet perfect in function. It could shatter stone, yet bless a child. In many ways, it was the physical expression of the Norse belief that power must be both feared and revered. In modern times, Mjolnir is often seen as a symbol of strength and defiance, but in the world of the Vikings, it was something more layered. It represented protection, community, and sacred duty. It was the tool through which Thor upheld the divine law, not just by fighting, but by blessing. In every thunderclap, people didn't just hear a god's rage, they heard his promise to watch over them. Thus, Mjolnir stands as one of the most unique and profound symbols in mythology. It didn't just change the world by force, it held it together with grace. Its power was not just in the might of its strike, but in the quiet, sacred moments where it passed over a bride's lap, rested near a newborn, or hovered above the body of the dead. It was the hammer of storm and silence, of battle and peace, of death and life. The giants, or Jötnar, were not mere monsters in Norse mythology. They were primordial beings, ancient as the cosmos itself, born from the raw elements of fire and ice. They were the forces of nature personified, wild storms, towering mountains, endless seas, and the bitter cold of the north. They were not evil in the moral sense, but they were dangerous, unpredictable, and often hostile to the gods and the orderly world they tried to preserve. And yet, for all their power, their size, and their fearsome magic, there was one thing the giants feared above all else: Mjolnir. The fear of Thor's hammer ran deep among the Jötnar. It was not just a tool of war, it was a divine enforcer. When the hammer appeared, it meant judgment. It meant that the gods were not merely defending themselves, they were responding with finality. Mjolnir did not give warnings, it did not wound or weaken, it destroyed. Entire legends are built on the trembling fear that took hold of the giants the moment they saw the thunder god approaching with the hammer in his hand. Mjolnir's terrifying power is evident in the sheer number of giants Thor killed in myth. The Eddas describe him crossing into Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, again and again, never sneaking or bargaining, but marching in head-on with storms raging in his wake. No other god dared to enter the land of giants so boldly or so often. Where diplomacy failed, Mjolnir succeeded. The hammer turned threats into corpses, and Thor turned chaos into silence. One such story tells of the giant Hrungnir, a massive being made of stone who boasted of defeating the gods themselves. After being invited to Asgard through Loki's trickery, he became drunk and belligerent, threatening to kill the gods and kidnap Freya. When Thor returned home and heard of Hrungnir's insults, he was enraged. A duel was arranged, and Thor met the stone giant in a vast plain. Hrungnir came prepared, wielding a massive whetstone as a weapon. But it made no difference. Thor hurled Mjolnir with a cry that echoed across the heavens, and the hammer flew through the air with unstoppable force. It shattered the whetstone, crushed Hrungnir's stone skull, and sent shards of rock flying in every direction. Though a fragment of the whetstone became lodged in Thor's own head, he remained standing. The giant did not. That story spread quickly. An immortal god, injured but victorious, using Mjolnir to slay a creature the size of a mountain. But it wasn't only giants of stone or brute force that feared the hammer. Even the more cunning, magical giants trembled at its name. Mjolnir was immune to illusion and trickery. It saw through disguise. In a world where giants often use shape-shifting and deception to infiltrate and manipulate, Mjolnir was the ultimate equalizer. No matter what form the enemy took, once the hammer struck, all lies were ended. This fear among the giants was not just physical, it was existential. They knew that Mjolnir symbolized something far deeper than just a weapon. It was a divine boundary. The hammer was the god's declaration that some things, chaos, betrayal, destruction, would not be tolerated. It was the cosmic line between order and oblivion, and it was always drawn in thunder. Even when the giants plotted to steal the hammer, their actions were drenched in anxiety. In the tale of Thrym, the giant who managed to steal Mjolnir and bury it deep beneath the earth, his desperation is clear. He knew the gods would come. He knew Thor would not let it go unanswered. His only leverage was the hammer itself, and his only demand was the goddess Freya. But this was not a confident ransom. It was a last-ditch attempt to delay the inevitable. And when Thor finally reclaimed Mjolnir, the fear that had haunted Thrym's every word was realized in an instant. The wedding hall became a tomb, the hammer returned to the sky, and the giants paid the price. This deep-rooted fear is also seen in the legends of Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world. At the final battle, the giants will rise en masse. The fire giant Surtur will burn the world, and the Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, will emerge from the sea to face Thor one last time. The giants know that Thor will be there, hammer in hand, ready to fight until the end. And even though Thor is fated to die after slaying the serpent, his role remains clear. He's the gods' champion, and Mjolnir will still be the weapon that strikes the killing blow against the forces of chaos. To the Jötnar, Mjolnir is more than just the hammer of a god. It is fate itself. It cannot be bargained with or outwitted. Its path through the air is a sentence already written. Its return to Thor's hand is the return of order, the return of balance. Wherever it falls, the wild things retreat. And so, in the dark, frozen corners of the world where giants still whispered and plotted, the sound of thunder meant only one thing. Their time was up. The storm was coming. The hammer was near, and there was no escape from the fear that followed. There is perhaps no tale in Norse mythology more curious and more humorous than the strange story of the time Thor lost his hammer. For a god whose entire identity was wrapped around strength, protection, and relentless power, losing Mjolnir was not just an inconvenience. It was a crisis that sent shudders through the halls of Asgard. Without his hammer, Thor was vulnerable. More importantly, so were the gods themselves. The mighty protector of the heavens was suddenly disarmed, and the balance of the cosmos trembled. The story begins with a simple, shocking discovery. One morning, Thor awoke and found that Mjolnir was missing. The hammer was gone, stolen, taken right from under the nose of the thunder god while he slept. His first reaction was not panic, but fury. The earth itself quaked as he bellowed in rage. But rage could not solve this mystery. Thor immediately turned to Loki, the trickster god, for help. Though often the cause of divine problems, Loki was also frequently the only one clever enough to fix them. And so Loki, ever the cunning negotiator, borrowed Freyja's magical falcon feather cloak, which allowed its wearer to fly across the worlds. With wings spread wide, he soared through the skies, diving between realms in search of the missing hammer. Eventually, he reached the land of the frost giants, Jotunheim, and there he found the culprit. Thrym, a powerful Jotun lord smug and seated in his icy hall. Thrym did not hide his crime. He admitted proudly that he had buried Mjolnir 8 miles beneath the earth, and that it would remain there, unless the gods agreed to a simple demand. Freya, the goddess of beauty and fertility, must be given to him as a bride. Loki returned to Asgard with the news, and the gods were horrified. Freya herself was enraged, her fury so intense that the very hall of the gods shook around her. "Do you think I am so easy to give away?" she shouted, her necklace Brisingamen glittering with divine wrath. The idea of being handed off to a lecherous frost giant was an insult beyond words. With Freya refusing to cooperate, the gods gathered in council to devise another plan. It was Heimdall, the ever-watchful guardian of the Bifrost Bridge, who offered the most outrageous, but ultimately effective solution. Thor would go in Freya's place. He would dress as a bride. At first, Thor was appalled. The very image of himself in a bridal gown, with a veil and jewellery, was more than he could stomach. The strongest of the gods, the slayer of giants, parading through Jotunheim in a wedding dress? The thought was unthinkable. But when it became clear that this was the only way to retrieve Mjolnir, Thor begrudgingly agreed. And so the gods prepared the disguise. Thor was dressed in the finest wedding robes, a veil pulled over his bearded face and a glittering necklace placed around his neck. Loki, ever the actor, volunteered to accompany him as his handmaiden. With the gods' blessings and considerable anxiety, the two set off for Jotunheim. When they arrived at Thrym's hall, the giants were overjoyed. Their lord's bride had come. A feast was prepared, and the celebration began. But even disguised as a woman, Thor's true nature could not be hidden. He ate an entire ox, ate salmon, all the sweetmeats meant for the women, and drank 3 barrels of mead, all in one sitting. The giants were shocked. "Never have I seen a bride with such an appetite," Thrym said suspiciously. Loki, quick on his feet, replied with ease, "She has not eaten for 8 days, so great was her longing for you, Thrym." "Still?" Thrym grew wary. He peered beneath the veil and saw eyes blazing with fury, like lightning trapped behind thin silk. "Why are Freya's eyes so sharp and fierce?" he asked. Loki once again spun a convincing lie. She has not slept for 8 nights, so eager was she to meet her husband. Finally, the time came for the sacred hammer to be presented. In giant tradition, Mjolnir was to be brought out and placed in the bride's lap to bless the union. Thrym ordered it brought forth, unaware that the very act would spell his doom. As soon as Thor felt the cold weight of Mjolnir resting in his lap, the disguise ended. With a roar that split the mountains, Thor threw off the veil and seized the hammer in both hands. Before anyone could react, he rose to his feet and struck Thrym down in a single blow. Then he turned his fury on the rest of the hall. One by one, the giants fell beneath the might of Mjolnir, their shouts drowned out by the sound of thunder crashing through the sky. When it was over, the hall stood empty, and Mjolnir had returned to its rightful place. This story, though comical on the surface, carries deeper meaning. It shows the lengths to which the gods would go to recover Mjolnir, not simply because it was a powerful weapon, but because it represented cosmic balance. Its absence meant that chaos had gained the upper hand. The giants rejoiced not because they had outwitted Thor, but because in possessing Mjolnir, they believed they could finally unmake the order of the gods, and it also reveals something vital about Thor. Though he is the embodiment of strength and fury, he is not without humility, at least when it comes to duty. He was willing to endure shame, ridicule, and discomfort for the sake of the greater good. He would even wear a dress if that meant recovering the hammer that protected the world. And for the giants, this tale is a reminder that no trick, no theft, no clever scheme could shield them from the inevitable wrath of the Thunder God. Even when disguised as a bride, Thor was still Thor. And once Mjolnir was back in his grasp, the fear returned. The same fear that always followed him like a shadow, growing louder with every crack of the sky. In the end, the story of the stolen hammer is not just a myth about loss and recovery. It is about identity. Mjolnir belongs to Thor as much as Thor belongs to Mjolnir. Their connection is not one of ownership, but of fate. When the hammer is gone, the world becomes vulnerable. But when it returns, so too does the storm. And with it, the promise that the gods will not be overthrown, that order will be restored, and that Thor, with hammer in hand, will always return. Long after the tales of the gods had passed from myth into memory, one symbol remained etched deeply into the daily life of the Norse people. The hammer of Thor, Mjolnir. It was not confined to divine battles or the pages of ancient poetry. It was worn, wielded, and worshipped by mortals who believed that within its shape lay the promise of protection, power, and divine connection. From the icy fjords of Norway to the windswept plains of Iceland, from the forests of Sweden to the coasts of Denmark, Mjolnir became more than just a mythical weapon. It became a sacred emblem that defined Viking identity. Tiny hammer-shaped pendants were worn around the necks of warriors, farmers, merchants, and even children. These talismans, often forged in iron, silver, or bronze, were not ornamental jewellery. They were declarations of faith, shields against evil, and quiet invocations of Thor's strength. To wear Mjolnir was to invoke the might of the Thunder God himself. For those who faced the uncertainties of sea voyages, the dangers of battle, or the harsh unpredictability of northern winters, Mjolnir offered a sense of protection no sword or shield could provide. Its image was a constant reminder that the gods were not far away, that Thor, with his unbreakable hammer and roaring chariot, watched over the world. In a time before churches lined the landscape, Norse society expressed its spirituality through symbols like Mjolnir. These symbols were deeply embedded in everyday rituals. Hammer-shaped amulets were placed in burial sites, tucked beside the dead as if to guard them on their journey to the afterlife. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these in Viking graves, each one unique yet unmistakable in its form. Some were plain and crude, others beautifully decorated with intricate knotwork and runes, but all carried the same sacred power. Even in life, the hammer was central to rites of passage. As mentioned before, during weddings, a symbolic Mjolnir would often be placed in the bride's lap to invoke fertility and the blessing of Thor. During births, it would be used to ensure the protection of the newborn. At funerals, it would consecrate the body and protect the soul as it crossed into the realm of the dead. In every stage of life, birth, union, death, Mjolnir was present. It linked the human world with the divine, the earthly with the cosmic. But beyond its spiritual use, Mjolnir also became a cultural banner. In the late Viking Age, when Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia, the hammer took on a new and defiant role. As crosses began to appear on pendants and graves, some Norse people responded not with conversion, but with reaffirmation of their ancestral faith. They crafted hammer pendants deliberately shaped in opposition to the Christian cross, angular, solid, uncompromising. These were more than decorations, they were statements of identity. "I follow the old gods," they said. "I belong to Thor." Some scholars believe that Mjolnir's resurgence during this time wasn't just about religion, it was about survival. As kings converted and churches rose, many common folk clung to Thor, the protector of farmers, the slayer of giants, the defender of Midgard. Odin was a god of the elite, of rulers, poets, and mystics, but Thor was for the people. He was strong, loud, direct. He answered prayers with storms and shielded the common man with his hammer. In a time of cultural upheaval, his image offered reassurance that not all the old ways were lost. Even today, the legacy of Mjolnir endures. Modern descendants of the Norse, whether by blood or by spirit, still wear the hammer as a symbol of strength, resilience, and connection to their heritage. It appears in art, tattoos, jewellery, and literature. It has been revived by the neo-pagan traditions like True, which honour the old gods and keep the myths alive through ritual and storytelling. In popular culture, Mjolnir has taken on new forms, wielded by superheroes and fictional gods, but its roots remain deeply mythic, tied to the thunder god who protected the world with an unshakable grip. There's something uniquely powerful about the image of a hammer. Simple, blunt, unpretentious. Unlike a sword or a spear, a hammer doesn't slice or dance. It smashes, it builds, it repairs, it blesses. That's why Mjolnir wasn't just the most feared weapon, it was the most human. It bridged the gap between the divine and the mortal. The gods used it to battle monsters, the people used it to bless their homes. For the Norse, symbols were not abstract. They were real. They were carried, touched, believed in. To wear Mjolnir was not to fantasize about myth, but to live it. It meant walking in Thor's footsteps, embracing his courage, calling upon his protection when the storm clouds gathered or the world felt unsteady. And in that way, Mjolnir became more than just a weapon. It became a way of life, a promise, a silent thunder in the heart of every Viking who dared to believe, in the shadow of fate, where even gods must bow to prophecy. The end of the Norse cosmos looms, an event called Ragnarok. It is not merely a battle, but the final unravelling of the world. A cosmic twilight when the sun goes dark, the stars vanish from the sky, and the boundaries between realms collapse. And in this destined chaos, Thor, the thunder god, faces his most terrifying foe, Jörmungandr, the world serpent. At the centre of this apocalyptic storm, Mjolnir is lifted one final time, not as a symbol of eternal victory, but as a weapon of sacrifice. Ragnarok had been foretold long before it began. The seers and prophets knew it would come, and the gods, though divine, could not escape it. They prepared for it in their own ways, Odin seeking wisdom from the dead, Heimdall watching the horizon, and Thor, ever the warrior, waiting with growing fury for the day his hammer would be needed most. He had used Mjolnir to defend Asgard countless times, but never before had it been so clear that the very future of all 9 realms depended on it. Jormungandr, the monstrous serpent that encircles Midgard, had been Thor's enemy since ancient times. Born of Loki and the giantess Angerboda, the serpent was cast into the sea by Odin, where it grew and grew until it wrapped around the world. Its very existence was a threat to the gods, and its fate was intertwined with Thor's. Prophecy declared that when the serpent released its tail and rose from the depths, the end would begin, and so it did. The signs came in waves. A terrible winter blanketed the world for 3 years, known as Fimbulwinter. Brothers turned on each other. The great tree Yggdrasil trembled. Then the final signs appeared. The wolf skull devoured the sun, his brother Hati swallowed the moon, and the sky turned black. The dead began to rise. Giants marched from Jotunheim, led by the fire giant Surtur, who carried a flaming sword that would set the heavens ablaze. Loki, now a sworn enemy of the gods, broke free from his chains and led an army of monsters across the Rainbow Bridge. The Aesir stood their ground. They knew they would fall, but they fought anyway, for that is what gods must do. In the centre of it all was Thor, chariot wheels spinning lightning through the darkened sky, goats screaming as they pulled him into battle. He was not afraid. He had faced giants, trolls, and tricksters, but this was different. This was the reckoning. Thor found Jormungandr on the battlefield, rising from the sea, its fangs dripping with venom that could kill gods and poison the earth. The serpent hissed, and the sky cracked. Thunder roared in answer. Mjolnir flew. The 2 ancient enemies met in a clash that shook the roots of the world. Thor hurled the hammer again and again, striking the serpent's scaled body with thunderous blows. Mountains collapsed. Oceans boiled. With each strike, Mjolnir pulsed with divine energy, not only as a weapon of strength but as a force trying to hold back the inevitable. Jormungandr coiled and struck, wrapping its immense body around Thor, filling the air with venom. But Thor, fueled by his belt of strength and his iron gloves, fought on. At last, with a final roar, he raised Mjolnir high and brought it down on the serpent's skull. The beast died. The sound of its death was not a roar, but silence, as if even the world paused to recognize what had just occurred. Mjolnir, bloodied and cracked, had ended the greatest threat to creation. The world serpent, the coil that encircled Midgard, was no more. But victory came at a price. Thor took 9 steps back, staggered, and collapsed. The venom had reached his heart. He had killed the monster, but he could not save himself. There, on the battlefield strewn with the corpses of gods and giants alike, the strongest of the Aesir fell, Mjolnir still warm in his hand, lightning flickering faintly across its surface. This is perhaps the most profound moment in all of Norse myth. Not because Thor won, but because he did so knowing he would die. Mjolnir's final strike was not an act of glory. It was an act of duty, sacrifice, and inevitability. In that moment, the hammer fulfilled its ultimate purpose, not just to protect, but to preserve, to give the world a few more moments of order before everything came undone. The hammer did not vanish with its master. After Ragnarok, when the smoke cleared and the new world began to grow from the ruins of the old, a few survivors remained. Among them was Thor's son Magni, who found Mjolnir on the battlefield. He lifted it with ease, something no other god besides Thor had ever done, and carried it into the reborn world. This passing of the hammer to the next generation is no small thing. It represents the continuity of strength, the inheritance of protection, and the rebirth of divine purpose. Even in a shattered world, Mjolnir remains. It does not rust. It does not break. It waits, because as long as there is chaos, the hammer will have a reason to be lifted. So, in the fires of Ragnarök, Mjolnir was not just the most feared weapon, it was the most enduring. It delivered justice even in the face of annihilation. It struck down monsters, not for glory but for love of the world. And when the last blow was struck, it did not sing of death. It whispered of hope. For in the thunder that follows every storm, in the silence that comes after lightning has cleared the sky, the story of Mjolnir lives on. Long after the gods fell at Ragnarök, and long after the final echoes of thunder rolled away into silence, the legacy of Thor and his hammer endured. In the new world that rose from the ashes, a world renewed, green and bathed in fresh light, the story of Mjolnir was far from over. Though the old gods were gone, their memory was woven into the fabric of the cosmos, and none more so than Thor, whose hammer had once held back the forces of chaos, had shattered giants and had blessed the lives of mortals. Thor's legacy is not one of conquest or divine superiority. It is a legacy of protection, strength and service. He was the god who stood between order and chaos, who did not seek out thrones or mysteries, but who fought because the world needed someone to fight. And in his hand, Mjolnir became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of resistance against destruction, of strength used for good, of sacrifice made without hesitation. And that symbol lived on not only in the gods' memories, but in the hearts of the people who told their stories long after the myths were first spoken. As the new world unfolded, some tales say that Thor's son Magni inherited Mjolnir. Where once only Thor had the strength to wield the hammer, now Magni lifted it effortlessly, continuing his father's role as protector of the new age. With Mjolnir in his hand, the hammer once more became the guardian of balance, the tool that helped rebuild what had been lost. The hammer, forged in fire and myth, survived the end of everything. It could not be destroyed because it was more than metal, it was meaning, it was will. For the Norse people, this legacy found new life in the symbols they carried, the stories they whispered to their children, and the sacred objects they wore around their necks. Mjolnir amulets became more than religious icons. They were personal talismans of courage. A fisherman might wear one to protect against the wild sea. A farmer might hang one over a barn to guard livestock from storms. A warrior might clutch it before battle, hoping to channel even a fraction of Thor's unbreakable resolve. Even after Christianity swept through the north, the hammer did not vanish. For a time it lived in quiet defiance. Archaeological discoveries from the Viking Age show that during the transition to Christianity, many Norse people wore both the cross and Mjolnir around their necks, symbols of two worlds side by side. This coexistence speaks volumes. The hammer may have belonged to the old gods, but its spirit remained deeply personal, rooted in culture, identity and memory. In art and storytelling, Mjolnir has continued to evolve, echoing through the centuries. In modern times, it appears in novels, movies, games, and countless forms of media. Often it is depicted as an unstoppable weapon, a mark of godhood, or a prize to be claimed. Yet behind all these modern interpretations lies the ancient truth that Mjolnir was never about brute strength alone. It was about responsibility. Thor never used the hammer to rule, he used it to serve. He answered danger with action, not hesitation. He brought storms not to punish, but to cleanse, to awaken, to warn. He smashed giants not for glory, but to protect a fragile order. And when the end of all things came, he lifted Mjolnir one last time, not to survive, but to ensure others would. There is a reason this legacy still resonates. In a world full of uncertainty, the idea of someone who fights not for power, but for peace, who sacrifices not out of fear, but out of love, is deeply comforting. The thunder god and the hammer he wielded offer more than mythology. They offer a model, not of perfection, but of courage, not of domination, but of dedication. And so, in every modern retelling, in every carved pendant, in every story of storms and gods and heroes, Mjolnir lives on, not as an artifact of the past, but as a reminder of what endures. It is the idea that strength, when guided by purpose, becomes something sacred. It is the belief that even the mightiest weapon can be a blessing, not just a blade. It is the legacy of a hammer that returned to its master's hand again and again, because some symbols are too powerful to vanish, even when the world ends. Mjolnir is not just the most feared weapon in Norse myth, it is its most loved.